Okay, welcome. I hear the difference. All right, welcome everyone to the second to last day of the Mimesis Documentary Film Festival here in Boulder, Colorado. We're in the Bodecker Theater at the Dairy Center. Very grateful for their participation and collaboration in this festival this year. My name is Erin Espily. I am a professor at CU Boulder here in the Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts Department and the Critical Media Practices Department, which is also co-hosting and contributing to this festival. I'm joined with several filmmakers, and today we're going to be thinking about extraction. Before we dive into introductions, which I'm hoping everyone will give me a little introduction to their work, I wanted to just kind of set the stage here for thinking about extraction, which has become such an important and critical topic in a variety of scholarly fields, but of course also in cinema practices. And we're going to think about, I think, extraction today on a variety of different levels. I want to think about it as an act, as a metaphor, a death knell, an environmental crisis we're facing, as a capitalist credo, as a 21st century considered necessity, or an 18th century hangover or a throwback, possibly societal undoing, and a violence upon the earth. So we've got many different ways we can think about extraction, and I want to try and move through both the material and the metaphorical today as we think about extraction in the context of all of the fantastic films, over a dozen films in this year's festival that really are confronting and grappling with the idea, multiple ideas, and myriad forms of extraction and what it means. So let's start off. Again, we have about a dozen films and many filmmakers joining us today. And I want to start with a filmmaker we have in person with us. And I was hoping we could go around the space here and everyone could give me a sense, and the audience a sense, of your film in the context of extraction in a material form, and material in the sense of the geological. Like, what about the geologic idea of extraction in confrontation with the earth applies to your particular film? And in so doing, could you give us, a little sense of your name and a little bit of a sense of the film that showed in the festival? So I'll start with you, George.
Well, thank you. And I want to just say, this is my one chance to say thanks to the Mises crew on camera. You all have done phenomenal work running two festivals at one time. Our virtual festival, the in-person. So I salute all of you and just a lot of gratitude. And thanks for hosting. And it's so cool to see my old professors and mentors and friends in this space. So Jason, so great to see you. And Emma and Sanaz, I saw your films last night. And I guess just the brief intro on the film, New Mexico Deathwish Diatribe, which is the second film in what I started calling my Anthropocene cycle when I realized there were going to be a whole bunch of these. And the sort of, I guess the inroad here to what we're discussing, I got to New Mexico Deathwish Diatribe because I was studying this idea of these golden spikes, like where, if this notion of the Anthropocene exists in the geological sense, if it's in the rock, the record of the rocks, there's got to be a golden spike, which is what, I guess, I'm not even a scientist in the remote, sense of the word, but just the idea that these folks have to be able to show, in the rock record, where's the shift. And one of those proposed golden spikes is, for all practical purposes, July 16, 1945. You have this uranium and all of this radioactive material embedded in the earth for, the indefinite future. And then since then, over 2,000 atom bombs have been detonated on planet Earth. So we're kind of in like World War III against planet Earth. The United States detonated more than half of those. So that's how I got to the project and thinking about this golden spike.
Absolutely. And I don't think Hope Tucker is here with us today, but she also, in her film, which is Adam Atomkraftwerk Zwentendorf, is also thinking about that as the moment, but in a maybe kind of speculative futurist form. But absolutely the nuclear as creating this layer which can be detected in the bones of fish, right, in the ocean the Pacific that where this was really created, almost like the iridium layer of a meteor strike. We have that forever with us. Okay, well let me with that maybe move to Jason, who was also thinking about New Mexico and thinking about the American West. Could you talk about your film a little bit, Jason?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Mimesis. Thank you, Aaron. What's up, George? It's good to see you. And hi, everyone. So my film, Ancient Sunshine, well, I should mention, actually, I showed a rough cut of it. Aaron, as you recall, in one of your classes, as I was finishing a residency in Colorado, so it's nice to come full circle in a way. But yeah, Ancient Sunshine is set in the American West, and it considers Earth defense. So it takes up some histories of Utah, of labor and anarchist direct action and solidarity building around experimental mining of the tar sands in Utah, which we can talk more about later if people are interested. Some people claim there are more tar sands in Utah than there might be in Saudi Arabia. These are extravagant claims. They may or may not be accurate, but it's tricky to pull the material out. But more so around something like questions of extraction. More and more, and through this film is kind of the beginning of my thinking, is extraction is a deep and tricky metaphor. It's come to extend far into the humanities, far into the documentary arts. It's taken on forms of exploitation writ large, not only, say, for example, mining or labor or minerals. So there's a lot to disentangle there, and there's a lot to hold. And I'm excited to go further today. If people are interested, specifically in Ancient Sunshine, I was interested in putting extractive economies into conversation with U.S. empire building through a sequence of Muhammad Ali upon his death, and then animal economies. And the film concludes with a somewhat mystical riddle of the metabolism of animals coming through a forge after trespassing into a fracking hut. And I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing from others.
Oh, thanks so much, Jason. Yeah, that makes me think of Emma. You're driving Dinosaurs, and the way in which you're kind of playing with the idea of the animal and the extinct species, and what we're actually pulling up from the earth, literally driving ourselves on these ancient extinct species. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your film in relation to that literal material extraction of oil.
Yeah, I think without wanting to repeat anything that I said in the film, I think, like, because for me it was like one of these things that just seemed like horrifying that it could be dinosaurs, even though now of course we know it's not. But this, like, I think like a big thing of this film was like playing with truth and how truth feels so permeable, and our perceptions change all the time based on like what is happening in society. And so for me, yeah, driving through this desolate landscape, it was this idea that it was not a good thing that fossil fuels could be from dinosaurs. And so when I found out that was actually a selling point back in the early days, it just made me think about all these other ways that we kind of collectively tell ourselves things, and how that shapes the way of our thinking, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that connects so beautifully to Sanaz, your work. It's always hard to know where to look here. But maybe you could talk a little about your relationship to oil and oil extraction. And of course, thinking about the capitalistic mentality too of the Sinclair versus BP and the ways in which that has changed people's relationship, the literal storytelling that comes out of the ways in which different companies are attempting to sell their oil and sell their materials.
Okay. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you, Mimesis, for having me and for this fantastic festival and also the conversation. It's always great to actually speak with the filmmakers also who are in the program. So it's a pleasure to be with the conversation with everyone. I've been working on oil since 2017. It's part of my doctoral project, One Image, Two Acts. I consider it the first chapter of a series of 3 films that I'm working on at the moment, on the next 2 films to conclude my PhD project and my work on oil. For a time being, I think it will be going on for some time because the breadth and the scope of what I've started to working on is so wide that I don't think one film could do justice. It's just the beginning. I've been working with the British Petroleum Archives primarily, which is photographic and film archives, along with a lot of documents, and that I'm working less with. But although I pull threads from some of the information from the documents as well. Speaking of extraction in particular, as Jason said, I think it's something that has to be disentangled a lot. And how I approached it in the film was that I was really keen on approaching archives as a technology in and of themselves, as a form of extraction as well, and really think about how corporations and British Petroleum really used these archival practices and archival regime as a form of extraction of stories, of images, of becoming materials with which they could narrativize their own corporate history. And for me, the BP archives was this very tailored and very sanitized narrative. The material was really compromised to work with. And from the beginning, I was always looking for a counter archive, if you will, and really thinking about how can I really understand this relationship between oil as this material commodity and also archives themselves as a monetized system in which images have become copyrighted, images have become monetized themselves, and really this relationship between archives, visuality, and extraction, like they form this really like assembly that I had to navigate I'm navigating the project, and I was hoping really to unpack it in the film. So extraction of materials and oil and gas, I think is very coterminous by extraction of images, and that a lot of companies, not only BP, a lot of the corporations in the early 20th century, they really had this practice of self-forging, really self-fashioning. So, and it's really interesting to really see that how much of that ways of extraction of narratives have has developed over the century. In what ways can we really work with them? How can we enter that space? How can we really use different ways, speculative, experimental, archival sort of strategies to really break that chain?
Great. Thank you so much, Sanaz. That's wonderful. I do want to really dive back into the conversation around archive and whether we can think of it beyond metaphor, but you've done that already so beautifully. So let's come back to that. And maybe we could kind of segue from there to Jean-Jacques. By the way, Jean-Jacques, great to see you. You've also been in Boulder in the past, so it's great to have you here virtually. Could you talk a little bit about uranium and the relationship to your film?
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. Yeah, thanks everyone. I mean, Mises, I'm very excited to be here with this panel. Yeah, it's funny. The film actually didn't even start being about uranium. It started being about oil. When I started the film, I was not so much interested about uranium in particular, even though we can talk about how it developed into a uranium film and how that's particular to the film. But I was at the time when I started the film, I was living in Ecuador, and I was interested in oil actually, but not even oil as oil, but oil as sort of like as egregore, a thought form that had been conjured in kind of the collective psyche. You know, I feel like oil, uranium, these resource extraction industries have kind of defined the collective subconscious of all of us. You know, we cannot imagine escaping these sort of systems. But eventually I ended up in Canada and had to kind of completely morph the idea into uranium. And then the particulars of uranium turned, you know, the uranium ghost in the oil ghost into a uranium ghost, let's say, you know, a different type of haunting that has a completely different history. And so figuring out how that history kind of morphs in present, past, future was something that I was very interested in, and how we can maybe shake that off, and using speculative and fabulation as a way of studying kind of like the history through the archive, which is something that we can talk about because I also make use of the archive in the film. But also just, I mean, you know, because my film is set in the far north of Canada, where the very first uranium mines were built, and a lot of them are now abandoned, but, you know, there's still like a sort of like a haunting going on that continued. You know, it's like once the ground was cracked open, the Pandora's box was opened, you know, the ghost of uranium has completely kind of, you know, like, I mean, you can go to the Cold War, you can see how uranium acts today, what are the discourses around uranium, and looking towards the future and all this. So anyway, as I was making the film, I wasn't necessarily trying to make a point this or that, although I have my own opinions, but the film was more like a question mark about what are the ways of using this legacy as a haptic form in order to kind of question or fabulate around it. So anyway.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you brought up that idea of the haunting too, because for me that ties together as well, extraction and the archive and the resurrection that's happening, right? We're drawing up this ancient material in the case of oil, as well as with the archive, we're going back into the past. So it's this confrontation with the past, but so many of you, and many filmmakers right now, I think, are also attempting to use that past resurrection and kind of bringing back of ghosts to look forward and create these speculative futures and imaginings of what's coming. So it does seem like there's some really interesting entanglements that come about with that. Also, I love that idea too, that by thinking about uranium, you are inevitably enmeshed in oil. Like there is no escape from it, and I think that's true with so many of these materials that we're working with. And when I made the film called the Lanthanide series, I was thinking about these rare earth elements and found myself kind of brought back that mining always is, of course, connected to water, and so kind of piecemeal, you kind of are always bringing back other ideas, which brings us to another kind of inevitable material that is used in so many devices, technologies, and yet relies entirely on a kind of extractive component of human labor, which I think also is a key lineage and connector to all of these films as well. So Jeremy, could you talk about diamonds and diamond mining and your film a little for us?
Sure. Hi everyone. Really great to be here. My film is Diamond Boys, and it features a couple of veteran artisanal diamond miners in Western Liberia, one of Liberia's poorest counties. And I guess if I think about the film, you know, vis-a-vis extraction, three things come to mind. The first of which is what you just mentioned, the extraction of labor. And I think that the extraction of labor alongside the ways in which conflict and civil war are also extractive processes and create ongoing and transformative extractive structures that are embodied forms of extraction, I think is it's something that I was hoping to capture in the idea of two old timers talking about a life, and a life that is also erased in many ways through more dominant discourses about extraction, neoliberal forms of extraction, a bias towards large-scale mining versus artisanal and labor sensitive forms of mining. And so that's, I guess, how I would conceptualize its relationship to conflict. In terms of the material, I think it's that tension between the artisanal, the individual, and the social versus the large-scale and elite-driven forms of extraction that so dominate, including kind of the post-conflict imaginary of what it means to restore or what it means to rebuild or rehabilitate, that I think is really ought to be seen as an ongoing form of extractive violence as well, and metaphorical. I'm really interested in the roles that we all play in extracting stories. How the filmic and research encounter participate or model or resist these same kinds of processes. How film works to reproduce, but maybe also in small ways resist other forms of academic tendencies that tend to erase. I'm thinking especially of anonymity practices, and about how anonymity practices can erase people's stories and ownership of lives and stories. Perhaps film, although I think it extends a lot of the violence as we've been discussing, it can perhaps resist, at least in that aspect, in giving us names and people kind of more directly.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I wonder, Sanaz, if you want to kind of take the reins again and thinking, because your film also considers labor and the ways in which that has extractive components as well.
Yeah, I was also very keen on exploring the issue of labor and extraction of labor, and also the labor of being in a photograph, if you will. And I think that's something that I've explored a lot in the film, and partly is, I come from a photography background, and I'm always really interested in exploring this notion of photographic event, and really trying to disentangle the participants of an image and the afterlife of the image. But on the other hand, I've also worked with Professor Kaveh Ehsani, who is an Iranian historian of oil industry in Iran. His whole scholarly work has been around the social history of labor in Iran, and how a lot of the labor strikes that happened or is happening at the moment, also around the notion of labor and equal pay, just living conditions and whatnot, really were so instrumental in the political condition, and at a time in the oil company, also in a lot of the strikes that they led to the nationalization movement. Oil workers were really instrumental up to the revolution in 1979. So the figure of the oil worker, especially sometimes when we think about the some of the literatures that are around the oil industry, they tend to fall behind or fall out of the picture a little bit, and how much the oil worker is a political agent. It's very instrumental in a lot of the political movements. So that has been always recurring for me, and has been really important in exploring more in my project. And in the film, I was also really struck by the fact that what do we see from this division between the the company life as the seeming public life and the private life of the oil workers, because the company becomes almost like a country, right? They try to really play with that idea, or at least back when the formation of the oil companies were so centered around company towns and oil towns. It's very different now. It's very disentangled, and it's very sort of like geographically completely globally situated. So the idea that the oil worker subjectivity is so dispersed in the company town, and it's so always made visible through its relationship with the visible oil infrastructure. The oil worker is always in front of the refinery setting. The oil worker is always at the moment of doing a labor for the company. So, these all create these allegories almost, right? That we have to really look them as a form of visibility, but also as a way of like silencing, right? So the more I was working with the BP archives, the more I had to really remind myself that I really have to think about how much of this extraction of labor was also about production of silences along the way, and really see that as a form of mapping, really to work with these materials, to look at these photographs, but at the same time really try to read them always relationally and comparatively, and bring together other materials that they can really disrupt that sense of cohesion and a sense of linearity of extraction that's usually disseminated within these archives.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It makes me think again of Hope's film, and thinking about the resistance that actually succeeded in preventing the opening of the nuclear plant. Jason, I wonder too if you want to tag in there to that idea of resistance, and because that was such a key part of your film as well, and kind of labor strikes.
Sure. Excuse me. There's so much to say. This is such a rich conversation, so thank you, everyone. In terms of resistance, in Ancient Sunshine, this film, I think it plays out in maybe 3 different ways, or that's my design, anyways, of the film. First of all, in investigating a labor history in Utah, which is not particularly well known, about unions in the coal mining industry in Utah. I think it's important to bring that to light. It's easy to forget, to let labor history disappear into the the glistening surface of oil, maybe. The other kind of resistance in the film, which I'll speak to, maybe I'll leave out the third, is the formal resistance, in which I try to align some questions of extraction with poesis, by which I mean, kind of loosely, things making other things, and some questions there about the force of the sun, and the reliance of all life form on the sun, and the role the human hand plays in casting animal forms, ideological, metaphorical material. I'll leave it there because I'm eager to hear other people's thoughts.
I'm so glad you came to the idea of form, because that's somewhere I definitely wanted to go. And George, maybe that would be a place you could really expand upon the way that you organized your film. I mean, I'm so intrigued with the ways in which all of the filmmakers here today, and in this, I think in this dozen films or so that deal with extraction and mimesis this year, are the ways that you guys have been really pushing narrative form and playing with structure as a place to upend ideas around traditional extraction, if you will, if I can push it that far. So maybe you could talk about the kind of tripartite aspect of your film and how you brought these different narrators.
Yeah, it is this like multi-perspectival essay film, I guess. And it is science fiction in the sense that one of the three narrators is some kind of extraterrestrial being from another universe, presumably, reflecting on, human, behaviors, in the nuclear age, and genocide as well. This being references extermination camps. It's very curious about humanity. So that's one voice, and the other voice is J. Robert Oppenheimer. This talk that he gave, where as I think everybody knows to varying degrees, he spoke out against what he created. He becomes this kind of Promethean character, and his voice is in this diatribe, but at times it's actually just more soundscape than actual, liminal words. He just becomes part of this oral soundscape. At other points, we do hear him sort of speaking out against what he's done. And then the third voice is my own, just completely, I have no problem not being lacking in expertise. It's not a problem at all. It's just a possibility of we can ask questions about anything as an essayist. I'm curious about the history of light from 13.8 billion years ago to July 16, 1945. So that's kind of what I do in 10 minutes, explore this, deep time space and just ask questions, and curiosity is important. In fact, that might be the key thing there, is that anybody can think about, these, maybe should think about, these kinds of questions and are implicit, we're all, implicated on some level and tied into this. So yeah, it's those three voices, and I guess there's a narrative structure there. As incoherent as it maybe actually is structurally, it's part of the design. Just roll with it,
Does anybody else want to chime in? Jean-Jacques, maybe? Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but Jeremy brought up the idea of, the violence, the extractionary violence that might be even implicit in the documentary practice itself, and then, but this idea of form, I think, is something that can pry open kind of like a response to that idea of, the violence of extraction, because there's one of the things that I was thinking in my film that in a sense was parallel to this question was this idea of extraction, but also extraction as inception. Let's say because we have been incepted into this kind of this this capitalist realist idea of we are with these systems of extraction violence, through the extraction of natural resources or whatever, and even though we know they're dooming us at the end of the day, we can't seem to shake them off and all this. Then Sanaz brought this idea of the relational kind of component of dealing with. I love the word you use, mapping. Using the form as a way of mapping, thinking of. And I haven't been able to watch all the films. I live on the road right now, so I was only able to watch a handful of the films last night. I was very curious about George's film, New Mexico Deathwish Diatribe, precisely because of this idea of form and fabulation as a form of emanation is kind of constant, and I think that while using form in a very kind of personal way, maybe I can point maybe Walter Benjamin's idea of the ritualized value of the art making versus the exhibitionist value of the art piece, form being something inherently personal, and maybe going back to that idea of curiosity. I'm kind of sprinkling this shit all over the place, but so it's not really a question, I guess. Maybe someone can pick up from there, but I like the idea of mapping, glitching, disrupting the entire hierarchy of extraction that might be implicit in documentary. And at least one of the ways that I've tried to utilize that is or apply that has been to the gestural practice of form, curiosity, form. I don't know, it's what this filmmaker I really love, Deborah Stratman, calls taunting the abyss. How can we taunt the abyss through practice? Anyway, there it goes.
Let me just open up to anybody who wants to jump in there.
I somehow, when you were talking, and from the little bits of things that were happening before, was thinking about scale also like the scale of extraction and how I think all of us are like, the films are talking about these things on these massive scales, but then in our own practice, it's like a much smaller scale. And I don't know, it's something that I've been encountering in my own work lately, like wondering what's okay. Like, I'm at my family's house in Oregon right now, and like every day I kind of walk in the creek and I find these pieces of petrified wood. And it occurred to me, like maybe last week, like every day I'll find like these big handfuls of them and I'll take them because I find them. But it started thinking like, oh my gosh, like, am I doing something to the ecosystem by going every day and picking up these pieces of like small rocks? And like, how am I changing the river just by like taking them? And then somehow, because I'm not like digging it up, it felt benign. But somehow in like this recent time period, I started thinking, maybe it's not benign, like even if it's just laying on the surface and you're picking it up. And I think with like my film practice too, I know this is like a little bit all over the place, but with the film practice too, it's like you, when you're filming and when you're recording, there's this idea that you're, I don't know, preserving meaning or trying to take some experience, and then you go through the editing process and you extract something else. And I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about what is the impact of all of those interventions, even if they seem very small scale. Like, what's the cumulative impact of all these small scale gestures, both for our own bodies of work, but then for the ecosystem and the world in some other way too. Anyway, that's also maybe not a question, but just things I was thinking about when you were talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, that brings up too that idea of the, returning to the archive, which so many of you have employed, has been talked about today really as extractive, but also thinking about it in positive terms of recycling and of resurrecting and eliminating the need to go out into the world and interfere and use quite as many resources, whether that's, bringing a crew or flying somewhere, or just even, as you've also researched, Emma, that idea of the digital. Like, what does it mean for the resources right now of us streaming this? This is obviously taking a huge amount of resources to have any kind of life even after the making of the film. So I think, again, we can kind of we can kaleidoscope out or around and telescope out to the various ways in which that kind of extraction and resource use can either be subverted or perpetuated. Jeremy, do you want to kind of come into that conversation a little bit more? It seems like you've thought quite a lot, and I mean, structurally, the way in which Diamond Boys works is a bit more traditional, I would say, but at the same time, maybe you could discuss why you chose that form for your work.
Yeah, I think it relates to this idea about scale. I think it also relates to maybe what I'd label ontological violence. So they're embodied forms of extractive violences through conflict and through the labor exploitation that has existed and continues to exist in say Western Liberia around the diamond mining industry and life. But there's also like a form of ontological violence in terms of the stories that get recycled about conflict minerals, about what the right approach is, embargoes, forms that actually make life a lot harder for people at the ground level. So in my written work, and I guess also in the film work, and Diamond Boys is part of a short series that centers the everyday. So it was a challenge to think through ideas about how the everyday is an antidote to ontological violence of scale, which also suggests that there's no way out of the way in which these stories get recycled. In form terms, then that really for me was about centering a conversation in a home rather than out at the site where extraction takes place. So to kind of, however subtly, just create a more enclosed and safe place that also mimics just the idea of of something that is comforting and can be a resource, and that is a resource for people, albeit people that have had really tough lives. And so I think that just in form terms, it was about how can we use enclosure to address this idea of the everyday. And beyond that, then I think it's the theme of friendship. How can we use editing to suggest that friendship and social relations are also an antidote to those violences of scale and to those extractive violences. So the respite, the way in which stories are narrated alongside and through friendship, because I think that then friendship also kind of underscores a different kind of knowledge, which is the knowledge of living and the knowledge of expertise, of veteranship, of being a veteran in this industry and having a knowledge, but a knowledge that is perpetually discounted in terms of how the industry marches on, in terms of how the individuals are, how individual knowledge is ignored in those processes.
Yeah, and your film too has an intimacy that I think is bookended with that entry with the door opening and then the door closing too. That for me echoed as well, kind of entry into an interior space, i.e., also the inside of the earth. There's kind of an entryway there that opens and closes. So I really liked that.
Yeah, we thought that the colors somehow really, I mean, of course, it's so much of filmmaking, a lot of this is luck, right? Or just serendipity. But on reflection, we thought that indoor space somehow really mimicked the physical geological materials that were also on display in that space. And yeah. And then we tried to just use those occasional shots of outside to punctuate that, more just as a break, I guess, than anything. But yeah, thanks. We never know how much of these choices that we make are being noticed by others, or just or have the readings that were intended, or if that even matters. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, George, I'm also thinking about scale in terms of your work because of the cinematography, which is so lush and gorgeous on scale that becomes almost impossible to read. We're not sure if we're in the cosmic or in the microscopic. I wonder if there's anything you want to take on with that sense of scale.
Sure. It's funny, we were talking about black holes just before the Lowards came up and asked us what was inside the black hole. There's been a running question of ours, but it's actually more like play, a sense of play in the, how do you represent things that, ostensibly are unrepresentable, and just taking a very simple approach, like I do attempt, to represent these black holes that form at the beginning of the universe. Again, just according to, what I've read by people who presumably are, know what they're talking about. Well, how about some analog, 16 millimeter hand processed film that's been colorized and then dumping it into a digital platform, and I felt like a circle seemed appropriate. I actually wished that the movies could be circular, at least have that circular screen, like a bigger, larger circle, because you can fit it in the rectangle. But anyway, so I'm using that circle and just animating it, and it's totally primitive in its form, but yeah, it's like a line and two dots can invoke a face. That's like what's more complicated than a human face, really, like all the emotions that can, be sort of expressed. So yeah, it's just like play, even though the subject is, for me, it's very important. It's serious material. And the stakes couldn't be higher for all life on planet Earth. How do you represent a black hole? Well, let's just create a circle and animate it and see what happens and evoke a feeling about it,
Great. Well, I wonder, Sanaz and Jean-Jacques, if you guys might talk about some of your aesthetic strategies, especially of using archival footage and making some of those kind of combinatorial choices.
I go first. Okay. So one thing I wanted to also mention, just in following up with the form, I think your question also relates to the question around form as well. I work with essay, like essayist strategies a lot in my practice. And for this film, for One Image, Two Acts, I used my own voice. I used interviews that I had conducted in the past 3 years. And also, there is an interview that he had done about his whole artistic practice. And part of it was about the runner. So, from the beginning, I knew I'm going to incorporate a lot of interviews in the film, but a lot of them didn't make the final cut because there was something about it was very challenging actually to work with interviews and going in and out of them. So that was something that I had to play around a lot in the editing. And the other thing was also around this discursive play between image and text and using them as substitute of each other. I'm really interested in the ways in which the captions that are used in the archive were really indicative of, again, that whole imperial sort of shudder, in a way, that imperial formation of these archives as the systems of identification, of surveillance for publicity and advertisement for the company. So the captions of the archives from the beginning, when I was working with the archive, was really jarring to me. It was really important for me to really disregard them, but at the same time really read through them, because it's really, a lot of them are misinformative, a lot of them are just simply not correct. So there was something about that, this relationship between what we see and what we are going to read as a caption under these images. So I really wanted to play with that also in the structure of the film. And for the archives, I was working with photographs. I had some films. I also was shooting in some sites. I opened the film with this cemetery in the American Midwest. So there was a lot of connection between the site, the locations, and what we see, the site of oil, right? And I really wanted to play with that by printing the photographs, installing them as objects, really taking them out of that two-dimensional frame, and really try to go in and out of them constantly. And I think having multiple voices also was really important to really speak to that act of constantly going in and out of the archive, because the archive itself, like what we see, is this, as I think it was Jeremy mentioning, that this every day, right? These archives are historical, but again, they are these documents of the seemingly everyday labor practices of these oil workers, right? So there's something in that as well, that my work was very historical, right? It was something that was really archival, and but at the same time, it was such a anchored moment in time and place that becomes this really interesting way to navigate through the storytelling, through the ways we connect them together, that they really unravel that the archive of it every day, but at the same time, a corporate archive, the corporate image. So I'm really interested in really creating installations with the archives. I often do that in my practice, and that has helped me a lot also in really navigating the story as well. So the relationship between the text and the image, a lot of it happens through the script writing, a lot of it happens in the editing room, a lot of it is very chanceful, as Jeremy said. Sometimes things happen and they're just great when they happen, and we just keep them. So but the question of form is incredibly important, and again, is a very important thing to mention, especially when we think about the extractive practice of documentary making and as well.
Yeah, in my case, the archive came in through like the research component, and it was just kind of thrown into the brew. And in my film, I used many different techniques: analog video synthesizing. I also used artisanal methods within film production. But the archive, at first I thought naively that I was going to be able to go and find permits to go film in all these uranium mines and stuff. But obviously all the images that come out of there are incredibly sanitized, feedback loops produced by the system itself to sanitize absolutely everything that, that can come out of there. Again, going back to that idea of the narratives that are kind of thrown at us so that we can kind of just go with the flow, go with the train. So when I started doing research on maybe, finding images of just uranium mines, like just plunging into the archive, spent hours and hours and hours in the regional archives of Saskatchewan in northern Canada. Eventually, I found some images where the system itself was shooting itself in the foot. So it was very easy to use those images as kind of like détournement, basically like it's like, oh yeah, we're throwing all these all this uranium waste on the lake right there. We've basically built a mountain of uranium waste. Well, it's very easy to like flip that onto you. Like it's like you did it yourself. But there was also like the like at the beginning of the film, there's an entire sequence that's completely composed of found footage and archival footage, where it was just a very beautiful images of the miners like working inside, and images that you don't see anymore. I mean, these miners are basically breathing all this uranium. I mean, 75% of the miners that worked there died of cancer, and the surviving ones, the Canadian government spread them around the country so that there wasn't a cohesive narrative that could be told. So anyway, there was this kind of chaotic thing, and it goes down to like speculation. Play was a word that was thrown up a little earlier. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about how these images were going to kind of play within the film when I was working with them. It was a lot of happenstance, chance. But I think that that's the way that, in terms of working with an archive, at least for me, it was very helpful to, rather than try and figure out exactly what the discourse is, rather than trying to completely antagonize the system that's already been put in play, like capitalism will just like subsume it, So it was a little bit of like trying to throw fireworks in different directions, so to speak, And the film is there. I don't know if it works or not, but yeah.
Yeah, Jason.
Thank you, everyone. This is very enlivening. I wanted to just share a few thoughts about friendship and play, and archives, plural and material. First of all, George, I've long admired your work and your commitment to non-expertise and assuming a position of a question, as you were talking about, because I think that invites us in to play with you, which is a form of friendship. And similarly, Emma, what you conjured up for me in your film was like being on a road trip with you. You know what I mean? Like hopping in your car. And I felt like that was an extremely inviting gesture, and opened up that like headspace you get into when you're driving around. We were like, what is that? Like, let's make up a story until we get back to the internet. Like those kinds of spaces. So I really, really appreciated that. In the case of Ancient Sunshine and Archives, I went to a mining museum in Helper, Utah. Total like drive-by, and I was never going to go back there. And I want to put a little pressure on questions around documentary and exploitation, because I was on the edge of doing a helicopter job on this project, which I wanted to embrace actually, rather than beat myself up over. So in this museum in Helper, I knew I was never going to be there. I knew that rights were not my question. And so I used my iPhone. And I just took pictures in that iPhone burst mode, where you get like 3-4 pictures, to produce something like a handheld animation. And what I wanted to convey through that material treatment was a very embodied kind of approach to an archive, a very like personal approach to archival images that are presented on the wall for tourist consumption, rather than move into something like proper channel. Because my sense was that keeping a foot inside of my own body and mediated experience out in the West would produce something like a tension. Because I feel like when you're out in the West and everything is so sublime, everything's always disappearing. And so I wanted to keep grounded in that.
Well, I think it's fascinating that we've kind of come to what I see as the antithesis of extraction, which is the generosity of a friendship or of a community or of a giving back, which all of you have kind of touched on in different ways or have offered up in the act of making a film too. So that for me is poignant. Emma or George, did you want to respond or take on anything further there on that conversation line?
Emma, do you want to dive in? I'll dive in first. Well,
yeah,
actually,
you could dive in first.
Emma's film, I mentioned earlier, I love this film, Driving Dinosaurs, and I saw it a few years ago, and asked Emma if I could share it in teaching, because it's just what Jason said. That's what I was writing down. It's like you invite the viewer in. That's so critical, and it's like our role. It's like we're trying to communicate and connect, and the stakes are so high. But again, it's like that lack of expertise that you pointed to, Jason, like, which is funny at one hand. On the other hand, it is like an invitation. Let's ask the questions and have the conversations. But Emma, I think your film does that so beautifully. And it's that tradition of, one part of the tradition of an essay film, which is all about just, pushing against the traditions of documentary and expertise, which, as we all know, we've studied and it's all rooted in a white patriarchal, frame of what is reality. So you just blow that up with Driving Dinosaurs in such, fun and inviting ways. Jason, I really liked how you framed all that. Really, really cool words.
Thank you. I was so appreciating what you were just saying about your film too, about just the play and the curiosity. And I think, Aaron, speaking to you saying that's the antidote to extraction, I do feel that's really true. It's thinking about our relationships as makers and as viewers of where the authority lies. And I feel there's something extractive about the experience of watching something that's trying to tell you something. You feel your free will is being pulled from you and you're being guided along this train of thought. And so all of these works, I just so appreciate the way that that's not happening. That we're having the opportunity to go along on the journey and discover or watch somebody else's discovery. And Sanaz, with your film too, you were using all of this real historical material, but there is something also playful and intriguing about your journey of discovery with it. I don't know. I really appreciate that about all of you. And and this process, I think that is what sort of it's not the reason for making, obviously people can have many different reasons, but I think for me personally, if I start out making something thinking that I know what it's about, I just might as well not start, I think that playfulness has to be part of the process, or else there's no point for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, going to what you just said, Emma, and actually what everyone has been saying, play, friendship, travelogue, all these ideas, I think that at the end of the day, and the idea of the amateur, I think that we need to go back to the amateurness of cinema and kind of invent new forms, and the best way is to just do it your own way, I think that all these techniques, I don't know if I'll call them techniques, but all these ideas that everyone has been saying kind of disengages the center, and it invites people to kind of question their own questions and go and create their own kind of versions of the film, I think that kind of emanationist practice is far more interesting and important than saying what's going on. It's so hard to, everything is accelerating. It's impossible to grasp it. I mean, I don't think that it is possible to grasp the now. I think that I think that it would be it's far more interesting to disengage time and figure out where these things fit. I like the idea that George was talking about the black hole. I need to watch this film. I only saw the excerpt on Vimeo right before, so I know that you used certain techniques that are very fun to me as well. So, but this idea of bringing the far past into the far future to me is essential to figure out where we are at, and that's something that I was trying to do in my film too. But I was trying to do a black metal horror film, you know, but you know, it ended up being what it was. You know, I like to play with genre a lot. But anyway, this idea of disengaging the center, you know, like allowing for like a sort of flux even within the watching, even within the recollection, within the making, not knowing what you're about.
Yeah, and I think working, I'm just also noticing a themes here around the idea of extractive technologies being kind of in this systemic world that is beyond oftentimes beyond our control. So attempting to address issues that are so large, so vast, and impenetrable that the only way to kind of access them is through this personal. And of course, the whole history of this, I think the way this festival began, and I think the way that many of us as filmmakers got started is working outside of that system, cinematic system, but also capitalistic system, and expectation that our films are going to, you know, make us a lot of money or something like that. So working outside of that, I think can be really, really fruitful. Well, before I open it up to questions from the audience, does anybody else, Jeremy, Sanaz, do you want to add anything else in here?
A lot of the conversation, just really briefly, reminds me of kind of the only two mantras that I usually go into a research encounter with or a new project, and both of them come from Veena Das's work on violence and subjectivity, when she talks about, number one, a gesture of waiting. So a lot of what we've been saying, including Aaron, this recent and intervention, and the one before, I think, from Jean-Jacques about the amateur, kind of speak to that as really powerful and necessary, not just like a choice, but like if we're doing this quote unquote right, then we should be going in with the gesture of waiting and not in a positivist sense of having figured it out. Thinking of positivism itself really as an extractive ideology where data are concerned. And then her other comment that's always inspired me is related to that, I think occurs in the same spot, is that gesture of waiting entails allowing the knowledge of the other to mark us. So how does that knowledge of that someone else imparts, and that is a gift to us as academics or as filmmakers or whatever, how does then our final product show that mark? Is something that I'm thinking about as part of this very rich conversation right now.
Oh, you're muted, Sanaz.
Oh, am I good? Okay. Thank you, everyone. And I just want to say, Jean-Jacques, this whole notion of bringing the past into far past into far future, I think it's just such a poignant sort of line to think about. So I wrote it down. And one thing that I wanted to mention as a form of closure is that I've thought a lot about this notion of subaltern modernities and petromodernity in particular. And Deepesh Chakrabarty has this notion of history as a waiting room for societies or post-colonial societies that they see themselves as to have to catch up with this technological developments and with the sort of like the European center. And as I was working in the film, I was thinking that, like, because of so much of this whole history of Iranian oil industry is so well recorded, is strangely well documented in its own ways, that the history of Iranian oil industry happened in an editing room, if you will. Like the waiting room and the editing room sort of like collide in this really strange way. And a lot of it that I was, some part of it that I also mentioned in the film with the Iranian New Wave was that how much of that editing room as a way of countering cinema, as a way of countering the narrative was emphasized. Sorry, I think do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, I just got a little noise in my head. Anyway, so this notion of history as a waiting room and how much of the history is constructed through this whole cinematic constructs, which I think speaks to Jean-Jacques' remarks as well, to how to decenter, which I think that's through the references that you mentioned with Deborah Stratman and Walter Benjamin. I think it's that notion of like different strategies that we can use to do those decentering as artists and filmmakers. Yeah, so I just leave it there.
Oh, thank you, Sana. Maybe I'll actually ask a follow-up question too, because I think, again, what's wonderfully powerful about your film and about the way in which you engaged with the BP archive was their propaganda that came about through the starting of cinemas and kind of using the oil money to then produce more images and then propagate from there. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of synergy that that you were able to hone in on the film. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about just the way in which was that a discovery, as we've been talking about discoveries, was that kind of a discovery that you made in the making of the film, or did you know that going into the archive that was all kind of interconnected? The cinema, building of cinemas, the history of cinema in that area tied into oil.
Yeah, so I knew about the role of the petrofilms and cinematic culture. Sorry, it's very noisy in my house. I apologize if I'm talking too loud. It's unconsciously. Mona Damluji is a film scholar based in UC Santa Barbara, and her scholarship has been really influential for me. And one of the reasons I started my PhD was reading Mona Damluji's works and really getting into this whole genre of petrofilms and cinematic representation of oil towns. And so I knew about the cinematic, the cinemas in the oil towns. But it's one thing to know about it. The other thing is to actually go and actually investigate the archive yourself and really find connections and really be part of that archival encounter, if you will. And the other thing that was really it was revealed to me throughout the process was that how much this idea of cinematic representation of oil and oil as an allegory was a theme in Iranian cinema, and especially post-nationalization. So that was something that I think was revealed to me throughout the process, and how much can I trace oil in the Iranian New Wave cinema, right? And in its social criticism of the unequal distribution of wealth that comes from the petrodollars, if you will. So there was a lot of previous understanding and knowledge and really interest in exploring it, but a lot of it also really came out from the process and the research.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Yeah, this also makes me think a little bit about referenced a few scholars, but I'm thinking of UC Parika's work in kind of zombie media and the ways in which things can be taken out of and brought back again, kind of bringing back the ghosts and the resurrection of work. And also, I can't help but mention the work of Denise Silva, who we had virtually as part of our Environmental Futures Conference this last year here at City Boulder. But her work too, again, kind of the connection between labor and the extraction of human capital as connected to resource extraction. So there's so many rich ties in here that I'm finding really fruitful. Okay, I know we have one question from the audience. We have one question, but maybe there are more. So I will open it up here. Maybe. Yeah. Were you going to ask a question? Oh, okay. Wait. We need a little more time to formulate. Oh, here it goes.
Oh, there it is. I was during this conversation, I was thinking a lot about extractions, needy possession and ownership and property for to exist. That's one.
So ownership and property as connected. Jeremy, I mean, I was kind of curious about the particular people in your film and their, you know, being in a space and that intimacy of being in a kind of a personal home that's surrounded by property. I don't know if that connects, but maybe I'm limiting it to that. But yeah, anything you might want to have.
Yeah, and Aaron, would you mind just summarizing probably for the whole group here, just because we're having some feedback issues. The last part of the question, we understood ownership and property, but we kind of missed like the meat of the question halfway through.
I guess just as it relates to extraction and extractions, almost existence relying on context.
Okay. Yeah, I think, you know, I'm more familiar with kind of post-conflict regimes of quote unquote justice or restitution or rehabilitation or reintegration. And in the Liberian context, whether it's rubber, whether it's gold or diamond mining or palm oil, all of the extractive industries have tended to follow a certain linear notion of restitution that is the opposite of reparative or restorative, which is that property and rights and mineral rights and management and profits revert back to the pre-conflict owners who, of course, were, in the Liberian case, mostly Americo-Liberian elite that had oppressed indigenous Liberians for centuries. So there is always an ownership and property issue wrapped up with the violence of extraction. And contrary to, oh, that sounds amazing, whatever just happened. It's like music to our ears. Hopefully you all can still hear me as well too. And now it's even hard to form a train of thought because I had gotten used to thinking through this feedback noise, which is maybe a metaphor for what we all do in these research and artistic encounters too. But so I guess if I relate it to then your question of the home, it's how again can that knowledge, although ironically it's in a space that we often assume as being private property, how is that actually a space that generates a different kind of thinking and a different kind of, and that allows for play or resistance to these notions about restitution, about return, about post-conflict orders. So I like that. I also like that the narratives, just kind of the storytelling and reflecting on a life, also creates a bit of space that works against other notions of ownership and form, which are always about profit rather than about other things. So to me, it's thinking through how is there still always a life that's worth living and worth narrating, and also a joyful life, a playful life. I think it was very lucky that the main protagonist of the film has a very playful personality, voice, everything else. That kind of knowledge that gets created in those intimate spaces can be joyful and can provide hope. That although trapped in these really big oppressive processes, that there is still a kind of hope that seeps out through that. That I hope also draws attention to the specific problematic practices, but maybe a way out of that too.
I can jump in on the question of
Great.
The ownership,
Yeah.
because I think I want to just bring up Ariela Azulay's recent book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, because that has been a major body of literature that I worked in my project. And she has this category of that archival rights are imperial invention, and how much of this system of the monetized archives, BP's archives are not, you don't purchase them, but and they're the only energy company that their archives are actually open to the public. Of course, you know, the materials that are accessed, they are very they cut to a certain time. Like you can't find any of the recent BP archives, more contemporary ones. They're not open to the public. It's the historical materials that they somewhat have passed a threshold of corporate liability in some ways, that they are now treated as research material, if you will. So although BP archives are not for selling, but then again, there's an issue of like who can go to the UK, who can go to, and there's something that I brought it up in the film as well, that this access is really important about this notion of ownership and property, archives properties as well. Because I think it's very important. There a lot of the archives that are at BP, a lot of them, the replications of them, different archives are also at Iran's petroleum museum. That is a new museum that was established in the past 5 years. Again, I don't want to go on too much of the side notes, but the archival rights as being an imperial invention was really important in the project. And because a lot of the materials of BP have found their way into other media companies, AP, British Pathé, and whatnot, and those are heavily monetized. We're talking about $28 per second archival right for footages and whatnot. So I think that's really important with these archives, in particular BP, and I think a lot of these archives are part of this like corporate image, right? And I think a lot of them, they have created, again, as Jean-Jacques also said, this sanitized image. So, yeah.
I can jump in for a quick comment, because the idea of property and what was it, the other property and ownership. I think that this can be open on both sides of it. The documentary practice, which is kind of, even if I'd say all filmmaking practice, even if it's not documentary, there's a dirty component to it just because of the current paradigm where we live, where, there's like the innate violence of pointing a camera. It's impossible to escape. But on the other end of it, like kind of going back to like entering spaces, I think that at this point where we're at, like everything has been, trying to find a word for it, digitized, but not digitized in the digital world. Digitized as in turned into digits. Everything is, architecturally speaking, everything has been framed along certain lines, borders, walls, and so this idea of finding the liminal space or parasitizing, say for example, BP or whatever, or the Canadian Uranium Company, whatever the hell it is, like figuring out how to breach those spaces in order to reassemble them on our turf, like figuring out where you stand in terms of what your, who's your community, what you're making why you're making the film. There's inevitably going to be a lot of questioning, a lot of ally building, community building that goes with it. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it well. But when I'm thinking about spaces and ownership, a lot of the times, especially when you're dealing with like power structures like this, I think that a lot of it is about putting, putting the time bomb on the border and waiting for it to crack open and enter. And, like I think that dealing with archives today, especially with what, I said earlier and Sanaz just mentioned, this idea of having to deal with the sanitized version, the hegemonic sort of language that is being pumped down our throats, how can that be disintegrated, glitched, I don't know, whatever word you want to use, remapped, reversed. Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you. Well, I've gotten the signal that that our in-person time here has to come to an end, in part because George here has to get to the airport. So we're so grateful for all of you all participating. Sanaz, Jean-Jacques, Jeremy, Emma, Jason, thank you all for transporting in here. And thank you so much, especially George, for coming in person. It's wonderful to have this hybrid event with filmmakers in person. We're so grateful to Mimesis for hosting all of this. So thank you all for your wonderful films, and I hope to see more from all of you soon on some of these same topics. And thank you for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Erin, for your lovely
you.
moderation.
Thank you, Erin, so much. Thank you, everybody.
Incredible moderation. It's so great to meet everyone.
Thank you, Erin. Bye, George. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great
Thank
seeing
you.
Bye,
Thank you
Jason.
all, Mimesis, for bringing this all together. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.